Just when we thought that AMD were taking over the mid-range, kind of mainstream, consumer-oriented cards, and Nvidia were taking the top-end, more enthusiast line, they've gone and released a curveball and announced the GTX 1060. From the start, chained to our past. So Nvidia today announced the GTX 1060. It will be launching at $249, that's the MSRP for the card, and it features a 6GB GDDR5 frame buffer. Now Nvidia are claiming this GTX 960 performance-wise is going to equate to the same currently as a GTX 980, which, as many of you know, is an incredibly capable card. For many, the GTX 980 was for about 6 to 7 months the top end card to get. The Titan X was simply too expensive to warrant spending that much money. You may as well have got 1 or 2 GTX 980s for that. And as soon as the 980 Ti was released, that kind of made the GTX 980 slightly obsolete, and the popularity of that card went down. Nevertheless, we can't remember that the 980 Ti only performs around 10-15% better than the 980 does, and the 980 is truly a 1080p at ultra settings and even 1440p at high settings, over 60 FPS kind of graphics card. Now for me, the 60 SKU, so the 760, the 960 and the upcoming 1060, previously they've been my least favourite graphics card SKU from Nvidia and the least relevant in my opinion. If you're going to go high end, you go with the 80 or the 80 Ti. When I say the 80, for example, I am including the Ti in that. If you wanted the highest end, you go for the 80. If you'd saved up a little bit of money and you didn't quite afford and you didn't quite need the highest end of graphics card, the really enthusiast level, you went for the 70 SKU, such as the 970, an incredibly good card despite its 3.5GB frame buffer, and many of you will know what I mean when I say that. If you were on a budget, if you didn't have much money to spend, aside from an APU system, if you were going to go for a graphics card from AMD, it was the R7 360 or 370 or 270 or 280, and from Nvidia, the GTX 950. Budget was on 50, enthusiasts were on 80, and someone with a bit more money to spend but nothing enthusiast level was on the 70 SKU. The 60 SKU for me has never really quite fit in. Not to say the 60 SKU isn't a good SKU of graphics card. It doesn't provide the best kind of gaming performance, and it's definitely kind of normally lags behind a generation or two from some of the higher end cards from the previous kind of eras, if you will. But this seems to change everything. Now let me talk to you about why you shouldn't get too excited about Nvidia going it's going to be the same as a 980, because it probably won't. AMD claimed it would be the same, the RX 480 would be the same as a 980 performance wise. It isn't, it's slightly below. AMD claimed their card, well, sorry, this isn't AMD's fault, this is more a third-party retailer kind of flaw, if you will. The MSRP for the 480, the RX 480, was $200 and $230. That card is currently going for no less than $240 for the lower VRAM variant. For the higher 230 cards, you're looking at about $270 to $295. And this GTX 1060, because the demand should be, in theory, so high for the card when it comes out, as many people were waiting for this before they made a decision between the RX 480 and the GTX 1060. That's meant to have an MSRP of $250 or $249 to be precise, but the demand's going to be high, retailers push the prices up, so that's going to end up being more like a $300 card. The GTX 1070 and 1080, the 1070 is a $350 to $450 card, and that thing's going for $550 in some cases, which is mad. So do I really think that the GTX 960 will stand up to the RX 480? I think the GTX, personally, there's no statistics and frame rate test to back this up yet, but I think the 1060 will perform dead on like a GTX 980. I think the RX 480 will stay in its position. Obviously, we'll get a little bit better over time with drivers and stuff, but that's going to stay just below the 980. Not by much, just below the 980. So I think the 1060 is going to perform slightly better than the AMD RX 480, but the 480, I believe, will actually stay at a lower price point for a longer time. You've got to remember that demand now for the RX 480 is still quite high, but the prices will only go down over time, and with the release of this 1060, the price for the RX 480 should get pushed down. And this is the situation where the 60 SKU of cards, in this case the 1060, whilst the price may be high at the start, with such a low price point RX 480, they should get pushed down fairly quickly on the front of the GTX 1080, because otherwise people are just going to go for the 480, and I think that's possible possibly the strongest point and the biggest advantage to the 480 is that it may actually be that the 1060 performs slightly better, but no one actually cares because the 1060 is coming in more like $270, $270, and the RX 480 is coming in at around $230. So I think as long as the gap between the two is tangible, I think the RX 480 can get away with being slightly lesser performing. Nevertheless, it might be that they come in pretty much odds on with one another. AMD and Nvidia both claim for the RX 480 and the GTX 1060 that they perform the same as a 980, and the 480 hasn't quite done it. Will the 1060? You have to remember that when Nvidia do these benchmarks and release this and go, yeah, it's this good, they are making that their way, if that makes sense. Who knows what they're testing that on? Are they going liquid cooled against an air cooled card? Are they going, there's a thing called the silicon lottery, and I won't get too far into the silicon lottery, sorry about that, but the way it works is you have about a 5% difference between the best chips and the worst chips that they sell. Anything below that tends to get chucked out or melted back down to metal to be remanufactured, but you tend to get a 5% difference between the best chips that they release and the worst chips, which is why sometimes you'll have a GTX 960 that overclocks like a beast, and sometimes you'll have one that's a bit meh. And it may be that they can very well pitch a worst binned 980, so one at the bottom of the pile for the silicon lottery, against one at the very top of the pile for the GTX 1060. So it may be that I'm not saying that Nvidia are being manipulative, I'm not saying they're cheating the system, but if you've got a graphics card coming out, you're not going to put it in testing in its worst binned value. You're not going to put the worst one out of a batch. You're not going to put the lower end of the silicon lottery in for your testing, because that's crucial marketing information. But yeah, this is a very exciting time. I'm no doubt going to have to do some GTX 960 builds now, 1060 builds. Get it right, James, after I've just finished my RX 480 builds. But remember, guys, if you haven't followed me on Twitter yet, make sure to go and do that at GeekaWhat. There's daily uploads now as well for the next 61 days after this video has been released, so make sure to drop a like rating for that. If you're looking forward to the RX 480, picking one of those up, or the GTX 1060, drop a comment and let me know. But as always, I will see you in the next GeekaWhat video.